Former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick has not played in the NFL since 2016 when he took a knee during the National Anthem to protest police brutality. Now NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell is encouraging teams to sign him.
If he wants to resume his career in the NFL, that obviously is going to take a team to make that decision. But I welcome that, support the club making that decision and encourage them to do that.
Bleacher Reports Master Tesfatsion joins me now. Master, great to have you on. I'd love to know what you think about Goodell's comments on Kaepernick here. Some NFL players have criticized his Black Lives Matter speech, saying it's long overdue. Is this too little too late?
Yeah, I think it is. And especially when you look at the shelf life of an NFL player, the average NFL career lasts about 3 seasons.
Yeah.
And so 4 years taken away from Kaepernick's career during the prime of his career, you've taken a lot of opportunities away from him, but you've also taken a lot of his salary away from him as well, because who knows what shape he's in at this time, 4 years removed from the NFL. It's clearly a response to the public pressure Roger Goodell is facing, and it's the same reactionary response that the NFL has consistently given based off of their stance and the way that they feel in this issue between President Trump and people who side towards social justice, which Colin Kaepernick has been one of the many faces, if not the most prominent face for.
Yeah. Master, my husband and I over dinner several nights a week sit down and try to figure out, okay, what if this team, do you think they'd want Kaepernick? They could use a quarterback. What about, and we try to imagine the scenario, who might step up, who might sign him, and where he might be a good fit. Do you expect anyone will sign him? And are there any teams that you say this would make sense? I think they'll go for Kaepernick?
Look, I'll be completely honest. If you would ask me the same question about a month ago, I thought Colin Kaepernick's career was done. Yeah. I did not think an NFL owner, I did not think the league would want to bring him back. It was clear that he was being blackballed. However, this change of heart that a lot of people are having as they deal with their own guilt of not signing Colin Kaepernick, I think the team that makes the most sense is the Seattle Seahawks right now. It was a team that did actually call Colin Kaepernick and did reach out and seek to see if he would be interested in joining the team. However, the one hiccup was that the Seahawks had asked if he would still be actively participating in protesting for police brutality, against police brutality, that is, and for social injustice during the National Anthem, in which Colin Kaepernick said he would continue to protest. And after that conversation happened, the Seattle Seahawks did not sign him and did not have a conversation with him again. I do believe, as Pete Carroll's spoken openly about that decision and trying to hold himself accountable towards this, I could see a situation where it would make sense for Colin Kaepernick to be Russell Wilson's backup in a similar role that they both could possibly play. I think the Baltimore Ravens could be another scenario in which possibly Colin Kaepernick would make a lot of sense. Basically, a system and a scheme that can take advantage of his skill set, that can take advantage of his pocket presence, but also his ability to scramble and make plays happen on the fly. And so the problem is, though, now is that a lot of teams are going to be questioning what kind of shape is Colin Kaepernick in, and is he capable of playing if in need a starting quarterback ends up getting injured? Can Colin Kaepernick step up and try and win a game? And as much as I would like to say yes, and the people who have supported Colin Kaepernick's cause would like to say yes, we're not sure simply because we have not seen him on the field in 4 years. Regardless of the fact, though, the NFL has to right their wrongs here, and someone has to sign Colin Kaepernick. That is the bottom line. The NFL has done absolutely a poor reaction to what Colin Kaepernick's been fighting for, and the reaction has been horrid until this moment.
Look, we have seen the videos of Kaepernick working out. It looks like the guy is in incredible shape. I know that does not replace time on the field. I think a lot of sports fans would love to see what he can potentially do. I mean, what an incredible thing it would be to see him come back and play so well, because he certainly looks like he has the fitness for it. Let's talk about the taking a knee itself. I mean, when he first took a knee, people were really divided on this. This was controversial, but now more NFL players are saying it, that they'll be doing it this season. What do you expect to see on the field this fall if we actually do have football? Do you expect that we will be seeing NFL-wide protests?
That's a great point. If we do have football, if there is football that does return this fall,
right,
I do believe that athletes will demonstrate and they will take a knee during the national anthem. And I can say that directly from a couple of the athletes in which I've talked to anonymously that have said and stated the same thing. There were people who were fearful to demonstrate and to protest during the national anthem because they saw the reaction that Colin Kaepernick received, and they saw that essentially he was blackballed for doing so. And the same response that has existed as well now with Eric Reed, who was with the Carolina Panthers, but currently remains as an NFL free agent. I think 100% you will see a lot more players responding to this. I think there are a lot more NFL players that feel a call to action in this moment, and then realizing that this is not just a moment in itself, this is a movement. And the only way to continue this movement is to let yourself be heard on the greatest platform that they possibly have, which is the NFL.
Do you think this is a sign that the NFL is starting to change? I know it has long been criticized for not, speaking up, for not taking a stand on a variety of issues.
Yeah, I'm always going to be skeptical of these large, massive corporations that are very greedy like the NFL is and are just all about their pockets and their profits. When you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar corporation like this kind of structural change is going to take time. And it's not simply just a statement response that Roger Goodell has to the NFL players who are demanding accountability. They're demanding transparency and they're demanding action. It's going to take more than just a social media video for that to happen. It's going to take more than Roger Goodell saying that he encourages and welcomes NFL teams to do so. The structure and the institutional structure of the NFL is very flawed, and it's not allowing for black head coaches to exist. They're not allowing GMs and executives that are black to exist as well. It is a very disproportionate number of the amount of coaches and the amount of people in leadership, and especially the amount of owners, because there are 0 black NFL owners among the 32 NFL teams, in comparison to a body of NFL players that consists of almost 75% that are black. It is very disproportionate across the board, and there is a lot of structural changes in which the NFL must do if they consider themselves as not only an ally towards black people and also an ally and a champion towards social equality as a whole.
Master, I have to ask you before you go, we raised the possibility of whether we'll even have football this fall. We were hopeful we might have Major League Baseball by the 4th of July. That's not looking good. As you look out, what do you think? We're going to have baseball this summer? Will we have football in the fall? What are you expecting?
I think baseball has no choice. At some point, they've got to play. It's not going to happen by the 4th of July. I think that's out of the question now when you consider the fact that these teams would have to gather together, would have to practice, would have to train and start playing. And in this time frame of the next 2 or 3 weeks, it's not enough time for them to properly execute that. However, baseball needs to play this year. Viewership has been down. Attendance has been down. There's a lot of interest among millennials like myself and Gen Z audiences that are younger than me that just simply aren't interested in baseball. And there was an opportunity that they have right now, and they still have this opportunity to take advantage of this moment that's going on during the global pandemic to try and grow their audience in a similar way in which NASCAR is addressing their own issues of how they haven't necessarily been the most inclusive sport. They're now they banned the Confederate flag, and they're trying to be more inviting and open towards their black viewers and potentially a black audience and a more diverse audience. Baseball has a similar opportunity to invite themselves to a younger audience. Now, the simple fact is, who's going to cave first? Will it be the owners or will it be the players? And this has been an issue that has been stemming up for years now, that's been bubbling up for years, and now it's on the surface of principle. Simply put, the owners do not want to take the burden on of $2 billion that would be lost as a result of no fans sitting in the stands during games. And they want essentially the players to take either a 30% cut or a 25% cut from their prorated salary, which the players have said, no, we're not doing that. You guys have seen record profits that have existed over the last couple of years. Use those record profits to eat the losses that you have right now, and then we'll keep it moving, and we'll be able to play. And you've seen some of the biggest names like Max Scherzer, who has shunned and publicly criticized the MLB for the way that they're acting. And so Rob Manfred has done a terrible job in managing this entire situation, and ultimately it rests on him to try and bring both of these sides together to allow baseball to happen. I don't know if I necessarily would have the best display of public confidence in Rob Manfred, but I think collectively everyone has to come to the table and realize that you have to pay these players in their prorated salaries, and you have to figure out how to navigate through these losses, as essentially every other league is going to do as well.
Master, awesome to have you on NBC News Now for the first time. I hope you'll come back and talk sports with us again.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.